Belonging rarely shattered in one blow. It wore thin first, thread by thread, through small humiliations people called tradition, through silences that taught a girl where not to stand, through hands that adjusted her posture but never held her with tenderness. Isadora had believed she understood that slow erosion. She had not understood spectacle. She had not understood how quickly a name could be made into a weapon, then cut away in front of everyone who once swore to protect it. Under sacred fire, with two packs watching, she learned that exile could be spoken in a single sentence and still echo like thunder in the bones. The wedding flames rose blue and silver in the stone basin, fed with cedar oil and moonflower resin, smoke curling in pale ribbons toward the open roof. Isadora stood in ceremonial silk dyed the deep red of rowan berries, bare feet on chilled slate, palms marked with ash-ruined vows. She had practiced that stillness for months. Breathe through fear. Keep your chin level. Meet your future mate as an equal beneath the moon. Dante Wildfire did not take her hands when the priestess signaled. He turned, slowly enough that every elder had time to see his expression harden into disdain, then faced both packs instead of her. "I reject Isadora Stormborn under full witness," he said, voice carrying to the rafters without strain. "Her bloodline is thin, her scent unstable, her bond defective. I will not tie Wildfire's succession to weakness." For one suspended heartbeat, no one moved. The fire hissed. Somewhere in the back, a goblet tipped and rolled across stone with a thin metallic rattle that sounded absurdly loud. Then sound returned all at once. Gasps, a few shocked protests. More voices rising in the sharp, eager cadence of people, relieved not to be the one on trial. Isadora stared at Dante's profile, at the perfect line of his jaw, the polished bronze clasp at his throat, the man who had smiled at her in private courtyards and spoken of rebuilding old alliances. Heat gathered under her sternum where the mate mark should have sealed later that night, then collapsed into cold so abrupt she nearly swayed. The priestess looked to Alpha Garrick Wildfire for instruction. He did not hesitate. "Enact Severance Protocol," Garrick said, "immediately." Two matrons approached Isadora with ritual knives used for braid cutting and crest removal. Their faces were carefully blank, the practiced neutrality of women who had spent years surviving powerful men by obeying quickly. "Do not make this harder," one whispered, not unkindly. Isadora lifted her chin and unfastened her own shoulder clasp before they could touch her. The Stormborn crest, a silver spiral stitched into midnight cloth, dropped to the stone between her feet. The matrons cut the ceremonial braid from her hair at the nape, then wiped her palms clean of vow ash with rough linen as if erasing an error from a ledger. The red silk at her forearm caught on the blade's edge and split. She felt the sting and then the warm slide of blood, bright against formal fabric. Dante finally looked at her. No remorse. No uncertainty. Only relief, as though discarding her had solved an inconvenience. "You were never suited to stand beside me," he said, soft enough that only she heard. "Do not pretend surprise." Inside her, thought fractured into blunt, jagged pieces. "I am still standing. I am breathing. Do not give them the collapse they came to see." Her instinct sharpened to a painful point, not toward attack, toward survival. Count exits, count witnesses, keep moving. When the rite ended, no one from Stormborn crossed the hall to claim her. Not her uncle, who had negotiated the match. Not her cousin, who had shared her sleeping room through 6 winters. They kept their eyes lowered, already adjusting to her absence. At the outer gates, a guard handed her a travel wrap and a small pouch with 3 copper crescents, settlement payment for dismissed brides under border custom. "By dawn," he said, "you are no longer Pack." The words should have enraged her. Instead, they hollowed her. Rain started as she descended the switchback road from Wildfire Hall, soaking silk into heavy strips against her skin. The mountain wind smelled of wet pine and hearth smoke she was no longer permitted to follow. By midnight, her feet were blistered raw, braid ragged where it had been cut, fingers numb around the coin pouch she could not afford to lose. She found shelter in an abandoned dye shed near the lower trade path, walls leaning, roof patched with rusted tin. She crouched beside broken vats and pressed both palms over the ache in her chest, where rejection had landed like a branded seal. She had heard stories of failed bonds leaving women fevered, disoriented, half-mad for weeks. She had dismissed them as cautionary embellishment. Now every breath scraped. In the dark, with rain drumming overhead, her mind refused the mercy of silence. I was trained for grace, for alliance tables, for speaking after men finished speaking and making them feel wise. I memorized ancestral law. I stood in freezing streams before dawn to prove discipline while boys laughed and called me overbred. I accepted every correction, every slight, every delayed answer, because I thought endurance would become respect. But this is the truth under all the rules. If he says defective, the room believes him. If he says no, I am undone. If I stay here waiting for someone to feel shame, I will die in this shed and be listed as an unfortunate weather loss in next month's census. By the second night after the rejection, hunger had thinned her patience to wire. She spent 1 coin on bread, gone stale at a roadside stall, where the merchant pretended not to recognize her. She spent another on salve for her split forearm. The last coin she kept hidden in her boot. At dusk, a stable boy from Wildfire territory found the shed and tossed a sealed strip of hide at her feet before bolting back into rain. The seal bore Dante's mark. You were never chosen. Report to upper yard at dawn for final accounting. Failure to appear authorizes retrieval. Her hand shook once, then steadied. Final accounting was not a legal phrase. It was theater. Another humiliation, likely public, likely framed as mercy. She pictured herself dragged before the same crowd while Dante explained duty and restraint and family honor, all the polished language men used when cruelty needed witnesses. She did not sleep. She sat with her back against rotting timber and listened to wolves calling from opposite ridgelines, each note carrying rank and claim and warning. Near dawn, hoofbeats approached on the trade path, then stopped outside. "Check inside," a man said. Boots splashed. The door banged open hard enough to shake rust from hinges. 2 Wildfire sentries stepped in, wet cloaks dripping, gray chain shirts dark with rain. "There she is," the taller one muttered. "Alpha's order stands. Retrieval." Isadora rose slowly, keeping both hands visible. "I was cast out under witness. You have no lawful hold over me." The older sentry produced a folded parchment, ink running where rain had touched it. "Reclamation writ," he said, "signed by Alpha Heir. Bride price unpaid due to ritual failure. You return until debt is balanced." The words were absurd. Bride price terms dissolved at rejection. Every novice in pack law knew that. But parchment, seal, armed men, and dawn fog made a dangerous combination. Law mattered less when no one intended to honor it. She backed toward the rear wall where a narrow service hatch opened to the drainage ditch. "That writ is forged." "Argue with the council after you walk," the tall one said, reaching for her wrist. She moved first, not graceful, desperate. She kicked the nearest dye vat, sending black-stained water across packed earth. The sentry cursed and slipped. Isadora lunged through the hatch, wood scraping her shoulders, then dropped into knee-deep runoff cold enough to shock the breath from her lungs. Shouts broke behind her. She ran anyway. The drainage ditch cut through alder thickets and spilled toward the old boundary stones. Mud sucked at her feet. Thorn canes tore her skirt to ribbons. Rain blurred distance and direction until the world narrowed to impact. Breath, impact, breath. Once she glanced back and saw gray cloaks weaving through brush 20 paces behind. Panic sharpened into ruthless clarity. If they caught her inside wildfire lines, Dante would stage whatever story suited him and call it duty. The border markers appeared at last through the rain. 7 basalt pillars carved with raven feather sigils, ward light faintly pulsing along the grooves. Ravencrest territory. No pack accepted strays without sponsorship, especially disgraced women wrapped in torn wedding silk. Crossing uninvited could earn imprisonment. Staying meant being hauled back in chains of law no law had authorized. Trade-offs, she thought wildly, almost laughing at the bitter precision of it. Choose your danger. She splashed the final yards and slammed her palm against the nearest wardstone. Cold raced up her arm as the boundary magic tested blood, scent, intent. For a sick instant it resisted, pressure building like a hand at her throat. Then the sigils flashed once, silver white, and released her. Behind her, the wildfire sentries stopped short of the stones. One spat into mud. Not worth a border war, he snapped. Let the ravens keep their refuse. Their footsteps faded. Isadora stood in Ravencrest rain, shaking from cold and aftermath, forearm bleeding through makeshift bandage, hair plastered across her face. The keep rose beyond the lower terraces, black stone and narrow towers half-veiled in morning mist. From this distance it looked less like a palace than a fortress built by people who expected siege and intended to outlast it. She drew one unsteady breath, then another, and began climbing the road. By midday she reached the servant gate, where 2 women in slate livery sorted crates of root vegetables under an awning. They looked up as Isadora approached, taking in torn silk, bare feet, and the posture of someone trying very hard not to fall apart in public. Name, the older woman said. Isadora opened her mouth, felt her old surname rise like broken glass, and buried it. Isadora Vale, she lied. I can read ledgers, mend linen, and keep night watch with infants. I need work for 1 winter. Room with the other staff is enough. The woman studied her for a long moment, then jerked her chin toward the inner courtyard. Steward's office. If you collapse before you get there, do it away from the cabbage. The remark was so dry it almost counted as kindness. Against her will, a rough sound escaped Isadora that might have been the beginning of laughter. Then, from somewhere deeper in the keep, a child began to cry. The sound was thin, exhausted, and relentless, the kind of crying that had gone on too long for comfort to matter. It followed her through the gate like a thread pulled tight. The sound was so raw that it seemed to scrape the stone itself, a tiny throat worn to threads and still refusing surrender. Isadora followed it across the inner courtyard, each step a negotiation between pride and dizziness, past rain-dark arches where guards in raven feather cloaks watched her with professional caution. None of them offered comfort. None of them reached for restraint either. In that narrow restraint she sensed the governing logic of Ravencrest, measured, suspicious, disciplined enough not to waste force. The steward's office sat off the kitchen corridor, warm with yeast and wood smoke, shelves lined with wax tablets and rolled inventories tied in black cord. The man behind the desk looked up from a ledger, silver at his temples, broad shoulders bowed not by age but by chronic responsibility. His ink-stained fingers paused over her torn sleeve. Name, he said again, less as challenge than procedure. Isadora Vale. From? Lower Ridge Settlements. She held his gaze and gave him the small truth nested inside the large lie. Recently displaced. He let silence do the work of interrogation. The crying rose again from somewhere above, jagged and relentless. A muscle ticked near his jaw. Can you keep your feet for another hour? I can keep them for a day. His mouth almost moved, not quite a smile. If you faint, do it where the healer can reach you. Matron Elski needs anyone with steady hands. Third stair, East Wing Nursery. You will be on trial until moonrise. A younger clerk passed her a folded slate-gray apron and a strip of linen for her hair. No sudden scents, no metal jewelry. Wash to the elbow before touching anything in that room, he said, brisk from repetition. By the time she reached the wash basin, her fingers had begun to tremble in earnest. She scrubbed mud from her calves, blood from her forearm, smoke and rain and old shame from her skin, until the water in the bowl turned brown, then pink, then clear. Her reflection in the warped copper above the basin looked like someone she had once read about in a cautionary tale. Ceremonial silk shredded into bands, braid hacked short at the nape, eyes too hollow for her age. She tied on the apron anyway. Survival often looked undignified up close. The east wing corridor narrowed as it climbed, windows slit for defense, pale daylight falling in hard angles across worn flagstones. Two nurses stood outside the nursery door with matching expressions of bone-deep fatigue. One cradled a feeding bottle gone cold, the other rubbed circles over her own sternum as if soothing a phantom ache. "New girl?" the taller one asked. "Trial help." "Then bless you and all your ancestors, even the rude ones." She pushed open the door with her shoulder. "I am Matron Elsky, that is Nara. Do exactly what I say, and if the little heir reaches for your face, keep your hair clear of her fingers unless you enjoy losing clumps." The nursery had been built like a chapel that had decided tenderness was a defensive strategy. Thick walls, low hearth, carved beams of dark cedar polished by years of use. Moon motifs ringed the windows in hammered silver. Toys lay abandoned in careful circles, little beasts sewn from wool and leather, none of them enough. In the center, in a cradle carved from a single piece of white oak, the infant arched and cried with exhausted fury, cheeks flushed, fists opening and closing as if grasping for a rhythm she could not find. "She has slept in fragments for 3 weeks," Elsky said quietly, as if ashamed of the number. "Feeds only when half asleep. Every healer says colic, teething, growth ache, spirit sensitivity, weather pressure. We have tried all of it. Baths, herbs, song in 6 languages. The alpha has not left this wing for a full night since the first week." Nara's laugh was a dry crack of sound. "And the council says we are dramatizing. They can come hold her at dawn and explain governance to a hungry pup." Isadora stepped closer before she could second-guess herself. Heat from the hearth brushed one cheek. The child's scent struck her first. Milk and cedar and a bright metallic note she could not name, like clean rain on stone. The crying hit a jagged peak, then stuttered. Tiny fingers unclenched. The infant's head turned toward Isadora with startling precision. "No," Elsky said softly, caution rising. "Stay where you are." But the pup had already reached, both hands opening toward Isadora with urgent certainty, lower lip trembling once before the next cry could start. The room held still around that gesture. Nara looked from child to stranger and back again, breath caught high. Isadora did not move. Her pulse hammered against her bruised ribs. She should be with someone familiar. "She is asking for you," Nara whispered, and now there was fear under the wonder. "She has not asked. Not like this." From the hallway came a measured stride, then the hush that followed Rank entering a room before he even crossed its threshold. Elsky straightened instantly. Nara bowed her head. Theron Ravencrest filled the doorway without effort, not because of size alone, though he was built like the keep itself, broad and unyielding, but because the air around him carried command honed into habit. Wet from patrol or training, dark hair pushed back from his brow, he wore plain black wool over leather bracers etched with old runes. A thin scar crossed the front of his throat, pale against bronze skin, visible above his collar when he turned toward the cradle. His gaze landed on Isadora's outstretched hands and sharpened. "Distance," he said, voice low and precise. "Now." The pup answered him with a furious wail and lunged so hard she nearly tipped within the cradle rails. Instinct overruled protocol. Isadora stepped in and lifted her before anyone could argue, tucking the small body against her shoulder as if she had done it all her life. Silence dropped through the room. It was not gradual, it was complete. The infant's breath hitched once, then settled against Isadora's collarbone in soft, stunned bursts. Tiny hands fisted in the apron and held. Heat slammed through the old scar beneath Isadora's sternum, bright and immediate, as though a buried wire had found current after months of darkness. It spread in a fast, spiraling wave through chest, throat, wrists, down to the arches of her feet. Not pain exactly, not relief either. Something vaster and far more dangerous, recognition with teeth. Rain and iron flooded her senses. The nursery blurred at the edges. Across from her, Theron went utterly still. His next breath came in sharp, involuntary. Amber bled into his irises in a widening ring, pupils narrowing until something ancient looked out through his eyes. The muscles in his jaw locked. For one bare second, the predator beneath his skin surfaced so clearly she felt it like pressure along her own nerves. No one else spoke. Elska had gone white around the mouth. Nara took one step backward and touched two fingers to her brow in a warding gesture, then caught herself and lowered her hand before it could become insult. Isadora could not look away from him. Terror rose first, old and immediate, memory branding itself over the present. Sacred fire, public words, a man choosing spectacle over mercy. Her body remembered what it cost to be named unwanted in front of witnesses. Yet beneath that terror, a different force gathered, fierce and aching, the tight knot behind her ribs loosening against reason while every defense she had built in rain-soaked nights strained to hold. This cannot be happening. Not here. Not after that haul, that fire, that sentence. If this is another trick of scent and status, I will not survive it twice. I know what crowds do with a woman they can label unstable. I know how quickly law becomes a stage prop in a powerful man's hand. But the child is calm in my arms for the first time in weeks, and his gaze feels like standing at the edge of a storm that knows my name. I should set her down. I should apologize. I should run before anyone says the word defective and turns me into a lesson again. Instead, I am standing still, breathing him in like shelter, and that is the most frightening truth in this room. Theron took one step forward, then stopped himself with visible effort. When he spoke again, command remained, but something rougher threaded through it, a fracture in perfect control. What is your full name? The lie lodged in her throat and refused to form. Isadora Vale, she managed, and the child made a soft protesting sound at the tremor in her voice. His gaze dropped once, quick and surgical, to the rejection scar visible above her torn neckline where the linen had shifted. The scent in the room changed, grief thinning under the warmth still rolling from her skin. His nostrils flared. Understanding hit him in real time, brutal and undeniable. Everyone out, he said. Elski hesitated. My Alpha, with respect. If this is an influence event, protocol requires witnesses and counsel notice. Theron did not raise his voice. He did not need to. Out. The word landed with killing-level finality. Both nurses bowed and withdrew at once, pulling the door closed behind them. The latch clicked. Hearth fire crackled. The pup sighed in her sleep-heavy way and pressed her cheek to Isadora's neck. Isadora swallowed against the rising pulse in her throat. If I have broken a rule, tell me now. I will step away. You crossed my wardstones under a false name, entered my heir's chamber during restricted hours, and calmed a child no one could soothe. His tone should have been accusation. It sounded instead like he was reciting evidence to convince himself reality had not shifted under his feet. You are either a strategic threat or the answer to a prophecy I have spent years trying to outrun? His eyes held hers, amber brightening toward molten. The pull between them tightened, unmistakable now, a live thread stretching from the scar in her chest to the center of him. Desire was part of it, yes, but smaller than the rest, braided with grief, fury, and the aching possibility of being seen without performance. "I will not be reclaimed," she said, voice steadier than she felt. "By anyone." A flicker crossed his face, something like respect forged in the same fire as rage. "Then do not offer surrender," he said quietly. "Not to me, not to anyone." The pup shifted, one tiny hand opening against Isadora's skin, and both of them felt the bond answer at once, warm and bright and terrifyingly clear. They stood in locked silence while the keep carried on beyond the door. Two wounded sovereignties measuring the cost of trust, unable to retreat and unable any longer to pretend they were strangers. The pup shifted in her arms and made a small, hungry noise, the ordinary sound cutting through the charged stillness like a candle lit in a storm cellar. Theron blinked once, hard, as if dragging himself back from a cliff edge only he could see. "Sit," he said, gesturing toward the low chair beside the hearth. "You are shaking." Isadora did not move at first. Her body had learned the danger of commands delivered in low voices. Men who did harm rarely needed to shout. Theron seemed to read that hesitation for what it was, because he stepped back instead of closer and set both hands where she could see them, open, empty. "You are not under arrest," he added. "You are not property. Sit because the child trusts you, and I would like that to continue." The distinction landed in her chest with disorienting force. She lowered herself onto the chair, keeping the pup tucked against her shoulder, alert for any shift in him. Theron crossed to a side table, poured warmed broth from a covered pitcher into a cup, then placed it within her reach, and retreated again. "You have a split forearm and untreated palms," he said. "I can call the healer, or I can bind them myself if you consent. Your choice." A king asking permission should not have felt revolutionary. It did. Isadora swallowed, throat dry. "Why?" His mouth tightened, not in irritation, in restraint. "Because pain makes bonds unstable. Because my heir has not slept. Because you crossed my border bleeding and still tried to follow nursery protocol." His gaze lifted to hers. "And because consent is not ceremonial language in this keep. It is law." The pup rooted restlessly against Isadora's collarbone. She shifted her hold, embarrassed by how clumsy her hands felt, by the way her pulse kept leaping each time Theron looked at her, as if she were not an inconvenience to be managed. He moved toward the cradle shelves, gathered a bottle already prepared with goat milk and herbs, tested its temperature against his wrist, and glanced back. "May I?" he asked, nodding toward the child. Isadora hesitated, then loosened her hold. Theron took the pup with practiced care, one broad hand supporting the tiny head, the other securing the blanket. The infant settled almost immediately, eyes still heavy-lidded, and latched onto the bottle with a small, fierce concentration that made Isadora's chest ache. She had expected dominance, claiming, a powerful male using proximity and rank to fold her into obligation. Instead, he fed his child while she drank broth and watched steam rise between them. The room smelled of cedar, milk, and clean wool drying by the fire. Outside the thick walls, the keep shifted through its routines, boots in hallways, distant doors, a life moving forward whether she belonged to it or not. When the cup was empty, Theron set the bottle aside and brought a basin, cloth, and a roll of linen warmed near the hearth. He stopped at arm's length. "Hands," he said softly. "Only if you agree." Isadora extended them, palms up. The skin was scraped and cross-hatched with dye-shed splinters, old training calluses reopened by the border run. He cleaned each cut with steady precision, no wasted motion, no flinch when she hissed at the sting. The linen he wrapped around her knuckles held heat for more than a minute. Then, too, easing the deep ache she had ignored since the wedding fire. She studied him while he worked. Theron Ravencrest carried power like a second skeleton, structural, inescapable. Yet here, in this guarded room, he did not spend that power by forcing anything. He spent it by refusing to. The pup finished feeding and fell into a loose-limbed doze against his shoulder. Theron rested the child in the cradle, one hand lingering over the tiny chest until breathing settled into a regular rise and fall. Then he turned back to Isadora. His gaze dropped to the ragged line visible above her neckline, the rejection scar that had flared when the bond struck. "I have balm for ritual burns," he said. "It may reduce the nerve pain. You can apply it yourself. Or I can." Every muscle in her body went taut. The scar was not merely skin. It was memory weaponized, an old humiliation burned into tissue. Showing it had always meant surrendering narrative control to someone else's pity or contempt. "I will not tolerate being inspected," she said quietly. "Then I will not inspect you." He held out a small ceramic jar, waiting. "I asked because reaching without warning would be a violation." Her fingers brushed his as she took the jar. A low thrum built in her chest, immediate and startling. She fought the urge to jerk away and break whatever fragile equilibrium this was. Instead, she opened the balm, caught the scent of rosemary and pine resin, and paused. "I cannot see the upper edge," she admitted, anger flushing through her at the confession. Theron inclined his head once. "If you choose, I can do only that part. One touch. Then I step back." She nodded. He moved behind her slowly enough that she could track each shift in air. His knuckles touched the skin at her collar in a single controlled pass, spreading cool balm along the ridge where old burn met new inflammation. No lingering. No claim. When he withdrew, he put 2 full paces between them. The relief was immediate and unexpectedly emotional. It was not only the balm, it was the fact that he had done exactly what he said, and nothing more. Isadora looked at the thin scar crossing his throat, pale and unmistakable in the firelight. "Who marked you?" His expression changed in a way she could not yet decode, a brief shuddering followed by an unadorned answer. "A prophecy ritual at the Moon Temple. I was 21 and convinced I could outpace fate if I bled for enough oaths." He touched the scar lightly without drama. "The oracle said my line would survive only if I stood beside a woman cast out under witness fire. I heard threat, not warning. I refused every bond offered after that. Challenged anyone who tried to force succession terms. Made enemies quickly." The confession softened something in the room that had remained braced since he entered. King and exile, both marked by public ritual, both carrying wounds others treated as political text. "You ran from it for years," she said. "I ran from being used," he corrected. "Prophecy turns people into strategies. I did not want a mate chosen by fear." His gaze held hers, steady and unsparing. "And I will not become another male who names you broken to protect his pride." The words hit harder than raised voices ever had. Isadora set the bomb down carefully because her hands had begun to tremble again, though this time from the strain of recalibrating everything she thought she understood about safety. Hours later, after the pup had slept through sunset and deep into the night, she was given a narrow chamber adjoining the nursery, more watch post than bedroom, with a cot, a washstand, and a shuttered slit window overlooking the inner yard. She slept in fragments, startled awake by every corridor sound, every creak that resembled bootsteps outside a dye shed. At dawn, a dream ripped through her like old wire. Sacred fire, Dante's voice, the crowd's hunger. She woke with a strangled gasp, half on the floor, nails biting her own bandaged palms as if pain could anchor her in the present. A knock sounded once, then stillness. "Isadora," Theron said through the door, voice low. "It is me. May I enter?" She could not answer for a beat. Breath in, breath out. The room was gray with first light. No flames, no audience, no priestess counting down her worth. "Yes," she managed. He stepped in and closed the door behind him, but did not cross the threshold line until she gave a second nod. He had already brought warmed linen and fresh water. No questions about what she had dreamed, no demand for details she was not ready to release. He knelt beside the cot, rewrapped her hands where she had reopened the cuts, then set a tray beside her with oat bread, pear slices, and tea strong enough to cut the cold in her bones. "Eat while I feed the pup," he said. "Then we face the day." By first bell, the keep had learned enough to turn uncertainty into accusation. The council chamber opened above the great hall, a long crescent of dark oak benches facing a raised dais carved with raven wings and moon runes. Elders in layered wool stood shoulder to shoulder with war captains and trade matrons, each faction carrying its own agenda like a blade hidden under ceremony. Murmurs broke when Isadora entered behind Theron, then sharpened when they saw she was not placed with servants along the wall. Matron Vea spoke first, silver hair braided with clan rings, voice clipped with authority. "My Alpha, this outsider arrived under false credentials, then established immediate influence over the air. We request confinement pending spell assessment." Captain Rune followed without waiting to be recognized. "Wildfire sentries were seen near our lower wards yesterday. Coincidence is not a governance strategy. If she is leverage, we are already compromised." Another elder leaned forward, lip curling. "Or she is bait who walked herself to your nursery. Either way, she should not stand unbound in this room." Each sentence landed like a familiar stone. Isadora felt old instincts rise. Make yourself smaller, offer appeasement, survive the hearing and collapse later where no one can watch. The urge tasted like iron in her mouth. Theron stepped down from the dais and took position directly in front of her, broad back, shielding her from the chamber's line of sight. The move was simple. Its meaning was not. "You will address concerns through me," he said, voice carrying without strain. "You will not interrogate a woman under Alpha Sanctuary." Vea's eyes narrowed. Sanctuary is for petitioners and war refugees, not unvetted bond anomalies tied to succession risk. Theron turned his head slightly, enough that amber bled into his irises, the predator surfacing at the edge of command. "Incorrect. Sanctuary applies to any wolf or human in my territory who faces unlawful reclamation, retaliatory violence, or coercive seizure. She meets all three criteria." Rune spread his hands in a gesture meant to look reasonable. "And if her presence destabilizes the air?" "The air slept 6 uninterrupted hours in her care," Theron snapped. "Longer than any night in 3 weeks. That is not destabilization. That is evidence." The chamber surged with overlapping protests. Spellbinding, impropriety, precedent. Theron let the noise crest, then released his aura in a controlled wave that hit the benches like pressure before a storm front. Voices died mid-word. Even hardened captains looked away. "Hear me clearly," he said, each syllable precise. "No one in this keep tests her safety again. Not by rumor, not by legal theater, not by arranging convenient accidents in corridors with poor witness angles. Anyone who threatens her threatens crown stability in succession season. I will treat that as treason against Ravencrest continuity." Silence expanded, dense and absolute. Then he did something no one in the room expected. He turned, offered Isadora his hand, and waited until she chose to place hers in it. He guided her up the 2 steps to the dais and seated her at his right, level with him, not below, not behind. A visible shock moved through the council ranks like wind through dry grass. This seat, Theron said, facing the chamber again, signals liability and responsibility, not spectacle. She remains under my direct protection and authority until formal review is complete. Any challenge to that protection will be made in open assembly, under oath fire, with names attached. Vea's jaw worked once. You would stake political capital on an unknown woman? I am staking it on law, he answered, on the welfare of my heir, on my judgment. If that unsettles anyone here, you are free to test your standing at next Moon Council and see who follows you out. No one accepted the invitation. Proceedings resumed in a brittle cadence, trade routes and winter grain allotments discussed through the lingering aftershock of what had just happened. Isadora heard little of it. She sat straight-backed at Theron's side, acutely aware of every stare, every recalculation, every old survival script trying to drag her into apology. Yet the script did not fit as cleanly anymore. When session finally adjourned, the chamber emptied in controlled clusters, each faction already drafting new strategies. Theron remained seated until the last elder left. Only then did he look at her fully, some of the iron easing from his face. They will push again, he said. Different angle, same objective. Fear is efficient politics. Isadora studied the hand that had signed orders this morning, fed a child before dawn, and drawn a hard line around her without asking for gratitude. I know. He waited, as if expecting more, but not demanding it. She let out a slow breath she had been holding since the first accusation. No one has ever spent power to make room for me, she said, only to place me. A quiet, almost rueful warmth touched his expression. Then, we are rewriting placement. Something in her, long-armored and rigid, eased by a single degree. Not surrender. Not trust fully formed, but the first deliberate lowering of a guard she had once believed permanent. Very well, my alpha, she said, meeting his gaze without flinching. Teach me the law you intend to defend, and I will stand in it with you. Theron held her gaze for a long moment, as if weighing whether honesty would burden or arm her, then reached beneath the council table and drew out a narrow iron box sealed with black wax. Then we begin with what men hide behind when they want cruelty to look legal, he said. Inside lay folded parchments, each tagged with a strip of raven feather thread. He placed the top document between them without touching her hand. The seal stamped into the wax had been scored with a knife and reset, but the crest was still visible enough to make her stomach turn. Wildfire. Isadora read the first line and felt the floor tilt under her. Reclamation petition under Bloodright, submitted to border arbiters, naming Isadora Stormborn as bond-failed property, pending return to original claimant. Dante's name followed in hard, elegant script she would have recognized blindfolded. Attached were 2 witness marks she did not know, and a thumbprint meant to be hers, pressed in dark red pigment. This is fabricated, she said, voice flattening with shock. Rejected mates are severed under witness fire. He cannot reopen that contract. He cannot under clean law, Theron answered. He can under contested law if enough people benefit from the confusion. He tapped a second page. He filed through 3 minor courts before submitting at our border desk, which means he was not trying to win quickly. He was trying to create paperwork volume so that anyone who refuses him appears partisan. A primary consideration revealed itself with brutal clarity. Dante did not need truth. He needed delay, panic, and a plausible accusation he could repeat until it hardened into public memory. If Ravencrest denied him outright, he would claim theft of lawful claimant rights. If Ravencrest entertained the petition, he gained access, witnesses, and proximity to the heir during succession season. What does he want beyond me? She asked. Theron slid the final parchment forward. It was a notice of intent for attendance at the coming Moon Oath Assembly, signed by Dante and countersigned by 2 traveling elders from neutral pacts. He requests ceremonial standing during Oath Week. That grants temporary immunity within the outer ring and audience rights before all attending PAX. Isadora stared at the words until they blurred. He plans to perform this. Yes. Theron's voice went colder. He plans to force a public reckoning where any outcome costs us legitimacy. If I hand you over, I am weak and dishonorable. If I refuse, he calls me lawless. If conflict breaks during oath rites, he blames the outsider female tied to scandal and claims Ravencrest's succession is unstable. His jaw set, and in a crowded assembly a child can vanish in less than a minute. The crux was no longer merely survival. It was narrative control weaponized at state level, with a baby at the center and her own trauma drafted as tactical terrain. By late afternoon, rain had stopped, and wind moved hard across the keep towers, carrying the smell of iron from the training yard and pine resin from the ward braziers. Theron sent sealed orders through 3 channels at once, to the border captain, to the neutral arbiters, and to Ravencrest's legal archivist in the lower city. No single courier carried the full picture. Compartmentalization, she realized, was how serious rulers breathed. She expected to be dismissed to safety. Instead, Theron walked her to the archive annex off the nursery corridor, where law tablets were stored in cedar drawers and copied by hand into winter ledgers. If Dante wants to bend custom, he said, pulling out a volume bound in dark hide, we anchor ourselves in the oldest language, not the loudest. For 2 hours they worked side by side at a long table scarred by generations of ink knives. He taught in the way he seemed to do everything that mattered: direct, patient, unsentimental. Sanctuary statutes, rejection finality clauses, oath circle evidentiary rules older than both their bloodlines. She listened, asked precise questions, and felt parts of herself she had bricked over begin to wake, not with hope, not yet, but with purpose. At one point, he leaned over to point at a margin annotation, his shoulder brushing hers through wool and linen. The contact was slight, accidental, and the bond answered anyway, a warm current threading from her scar to the base of her throat. She drew a breath too sharp to hide. Theron went still immediately and shifted away. Too close, he said quietly. I should have asked. Embarrassment and hunger collided inside her, equally fierce. You did nothing wrong. His gaze lifted, dark and intent, carrying a tenderness that frightened her more than anger ever had. The prevailing rule remains: I do not take what is not freely offered. The words settled between them with the weight of oath stone. She looked down at the tablet to steady herself and discovered she had underlined the same sentence 3 times without noticing. That night the pup woke twice, fed well, and fell back asleep with her fist wrapped around Isadora's bandaged finger. Theron sat on the opposite side of the cradle, forearms braced on his knees, watching both of them with an expression Isadora had no name for yet. Not possession, not relief alone. Reverence, perhaps, braided with fear of losing what he had only just allowed himself to touch. A brief, absurd thought flickered through her exhaustion. If anyone had told me 6 weeks ago that I would be discussing evidentiary doctrine at midnight while an alpha king warmed feeding milk, I would have asked what poison they swallowed. The thought almost made her smile, and the tiny crack of levity eased something tight in his mouth when he caught it. By the 3rd night under Ravencrest roof, the first reply came back from the border captain. Theron read the coded strip, then handed it to her. 2 sentries at the lower basalt markers had taken wildfire coin the morning she crossed. One had already disappeared from post. The other claimed ignorance and requested witness protection in exchange for testimony. Attached was an inventory list from seized saddlebags, sleeping tincture, infant swaddling cloth marked with neutral trader dyes, and a route sketch avoiding main gate inspections during Moon Oath influx. Isadora's pulse thudded at her temples. He already staged extraction logistics. He staged options, Theron corrected. Abduction if legal pressure fails. legal pressure if abduction fails. Dante is not improvising rage. He is running a framework. The phrase made her cold. Framework. Multifaceted, redundant, built to survive disruption. He was still the same man who had leaned close at her wedding fire and called her unsuited. Only now he had widened his audience and sharpened his tools. The second move arrived before dawn, slipped under her chamber door despite doubled corridor watch. A narrow strip of hide, no seal, the lettering unmistakable. You were never chosen. Her stomach clenched so hard she had to grip the washstand. For one old, terrible heartbeat, she was back in blue fire and public silence, hearing goblet metal roll across stone. Then another memory rose over it. Theron kneeling at arm's length, asking permission before touching a scar she wanted to erase from her own skin. Law as protection, not theater. Choice as action, not performance. She carried the hide to him herself. Theron read it once, and something in his face went blade flat. Who had this corridor assignment? 2 regular guards and 1 reassigned from lower kitchens. He rang the handbell once. Captain Rune entered within moments, clearly dragged from half-sleep and already defensive. Theron passed him the message. This passed 3 checkpoints, Theron said, either incompetence or collusion. I want names, rotations, and payment records before first bell. Rune stiffened. My Alpha, with respect, you are redirecting security resources toward personal correspondence, while oath delegations are arriving at both gates. Theron stood. He did not raise his voice, but authority rolled off him like pressure before lightning. An intimidation breach inside sanctuary quarters is not personal. It is a systems failure that intersects directly with air protection. If you cannot decompose that risk map, I will assign someone who can. Rune bowed, sharp and resentful, and left with the message strip in a leather sleeve. After the door closed, Theron turned back to Isadora. He is trying to reactivate your injury response before Assembly Day. Exhaust you. Make you doubt your own recall when testimony matters. She nodded, throat tight. He used that line when he rejected me. I know. Theron's hand flexed at his side, then stilled, restraint visible. I want to burn every route he might use. I also know control can become another cage if I am not careful. He met her eyes fully. Tell me what support feels like to you right now, and what feels like confinement. The question undid her more than comfort would have. She took time to answer. Do not isolate me where rumors can name me unstable. Do not leave me unbriefed. And do not ask me to pretend this is not reaching under my skin. Done, he said. In return, you do not walk unescorted outside inner wards until we identify the missing sentry's contacts. I can agree to paired movement, she said after a beat. Not escort lines around me like I am evidence in a vault. A faint, tired warmth touched his expression. Paired movement, then. By midday, the keep had swollen with visiting pack envoys for the Moon Oath, the courtyards crowded with unfamiliar scents, banners, and guarded smiles. Ceremony drums sounded from the outer ring while scribes checked names against slate boards and ward keepers renewed circle runes in ash and salt. Publicly, Ravencrest moved with disciplined calm. Underneath, the strain was palpable, 1,000 small adjustments vibrating toward rupture. Then the antagonist struck in full daylight. It began with a legal crier at the lower gate demanding immediate reading rights under Interpack custom. Theron, Isadora, Matron Elska, and half the council were crossing the west colonnade toward oath rehearsal when the summons reached them. Theron started to refuse on procedural grounds. Isadora stopped him with a glance. If we deny hearing, he gets to say we feared the text, she said. Read it where everyone can witness the fraud. The crier was escorted into the receiving court, flanked by neutral witnesses, and one pale, sweating Ravencrest clerk whose hands shook as he unfolded the petition scroll. Dante himself did not appear. He did not need to. His voice arrived through crafted language meant to sound sober and civic. Claim of lawful reclamation, demand for transfer at moonrise tomorrow, assertion that Ravencrest had interfered with bonded property and endangered wildfire succession rights. Addendum proposing conditional peace. Return claimant female, and Wildfire would withdraw all grievance regarding rumored heir irregularities. He had put it in writing. Return Isadora, and the child disappears from the battlefield. Refuse, and the child becomes leverage. The court erupted. Vea called it extortion. Rune called for immediate border closure. One neutral elder requested chain of custody proof on the blood thumbprint. Another asked, too casually, why an outsider had such unusual influence over a royal pup. Isadora felt every gaze pivot toward her, measuring fracture points. She stepped forward before fear could root her feet. "The thumbprint is forged," she said clearly. "The witnessing names are fabricated. I request full challenge under Oath Circle Truthbind at Moon Oath Assembly, in my own name." A hush followed, shocked and hungry. Theron turned toward her, alarm and fierce respect colliding in his expression. "Isadora, if I hide, he writes the story," she said, low enough for him alone. "If I speak through you, he says I was coached. He chose public theater. We answer in the same arena with cleaner law." He held her stare for a suspended second, then gave one sharp nod. "So ordered." Critical pressure snapped into place before anyone could breathe. A runner burst in from the nursery corridor, face drained. "My Alpha," she gasped, bowing so fast she nearly stumbled. "Guard Merrick is down in the east stairwell. Drugged, not dead. The air is safe for the moment, but the inner cradle ward has been tampered with. Someone keyed a bypass mark under the rail." For the moment? The words hit like ice water. Dante's paper assault had been cover while his second blade tested the nursery seals. He had not needed success yet. He needed proof he could reach. Theron's aura surged hard enough to rattle the copper lamps. "Lock inner keep. No one exits without blood verification." Isadora was already moving toward the nursery doors when he caught her wrist, not to restrain, to anchor. The bond flared hot and steady between them, terror and resolve braided tight. "From this step forward," he said, voice rough with urgency, "we assume he will strike during Moon Oath before sunset tomorrow." She met him with her heart hammering and her fear finally sharpened into something usable. "Then we stop waiting for him to choose the ground." Theron released her wrist and turned that sentence into action. They reached the nursery at a near run, boots striking stone in the same hard rhythm, and found Matron Elski standing over the cradle with a carving knife in one hand and the pup clutched to her chest with the other, her face pale but steady. Two ward keepers knelt by the east stair door, scraping at a thin line of dark paste worked into the threshold rune. Ravencrest silver had been cut with wildfire resin, a bypass keyed to nursery wards, exactly where a desperate hand would search in low light. "The mark was fresh," Elski said, "less than an hour old. Whoever laid it knew our sequence." Captain Rune arrived moments later with 4 guards and a leather folio under his arm, breathing hard from the stairs. He looked at Isadora once, brief and unreadable, then addressed Theron. "Payment records traced. 3 kitchen transfers were falsified through a quartermaster clerk now in irons. The missing border sentry has been found in a freight shed below the west terraces. Alive. Talking." Theron's stare stayed cold. "Names?" "Dante's factor, 1 neutral courier, and 2 wildfire men using grain wagons for movement." Rune swallowed, then set the folio in Theron's hand. "And I was wrong this morning. About risk priorities." The admission cost him. Isadora saw it and marked it, because war was not won by pride preserved. A horn sounded from the outer wall, then another from the lower gate, and the keep shifted into full alarm in less than a breath. Messengers ran. Portcullis chains groaned. Somewhere west of the kitchens, smoke began to climb in a black ribbon, too narrow for accident, too quick for chance. "Diversion at Granary 3!" a runner shouted from the corridor. "Gate court requesting immediate oath adjudicator. Dante Wildfire has arrived under neutral escort and demands assembly standing." He had come early, riding chaos he had started himself. Isadora took one step toward Elsky and touched the pup's tiny foot, where it kicked against blanket wool. The child smelled of milk and lavender, and that bright rain metal note that always cut through panic like a bell. "Keep her inside inner ring with double blood checks," Isadora said. "No corridor travel without 2 ward keepers and Elsky's sign." Elsky nodded once. "Done." Theron's voice cut in. Iron flat. "Only one exception. If neutral law requires public air verification, Elsky moves under my direct order with full shield escort and layered blood checks at every ring." "No." The word left Isadora with startling calm. "If I vanish into protected rooms now, he says he was denied hearing and turns every neutral elder into his witness. He did not cross our gate to drag me by force first. He came to make me flinch in public." The argument was interrupted by a crack of sound from the stairwell and a shouted warning. 2 men in Ravencrest Guard cloaks burst through smoke, faces cloth-wrapped, one carrying a hooked restraint pole used for rogue wolf capture. They moved for Isadora, not Theron, fast and practiced, voices pitched as if giving orders. "By Alpha Command, remove claimant to secure cell." Theron hit the first man like a falling wall, shoulder to sternum, sending both of them hard into the corridor arch. The second swung the pole toward Isadora's knees. She caught the shaft with both bandaged hands, pain flaring up her wrists, and drove her forehead into the attacker's mask. Cloth slipped. Wildfire tattoo ink showed along his jawline. Not Ravencrest. Never Ravencrest. He hissed and reached for a dart tube at his belt. Isadora twisted the pole, ripped it free, and slammed the butt into his wrist. The dart skittered across stone and shattered against the hearth tiles, releasing a sweet, chemical scent she recognized from the seized inventory list. Sleeping tincture. For an infant or a woman being carried. Run's guards pinned both men within seconds, but the damage was done. The attack had happened in the nursery corridor under Ravencrest banners, within hearing distance of the heir's room. Dante wanted everyone to know proximity was now purchasable. Theron stood over the restrained infiltrator, pupils narrowed to predatory slits, voice all edge. "Who gave the corridor passphrase?" The man spat blood-tinged saliva onto the stones and laughed once. "You already let him in, King. He came with witnesses." By the time second warning bell rang, the smoke at Granary 3 was contained. The outer gate court was packed with armed delegates and legal clerks, and the Moon Oath Stone Circle had been opened ahead of schedule because neutral law required contested claims to be heard on consecrated ground once assembly had been invoked. Dante had forced every hand at once. In the antechamber, Isadora stood with her pulse hammering and ash from the ward braziers caught in her throat, and every old instinct told her to disappear where men could not point at her. Hide. Let Theron speak. Let rank absorb impact. That instinct had kept her alive once, but it had also kept her silent while someone rewrote her life aloud. She remembered the wedding fire and the clean shape of Dante's contempt, and she remembered what came after. Rooms that went still when she entered. Women looking away so they would not be seen offering comfort. If she handed this moment to fear, he won with ink and voice, and history repeated. If she walked into that circle, she might break in front of everyone. She might shake. She might bleed. She might still lose. But the speaking would be hers. She lifted her chin and turned to Theron. "No veil. No side entrance. I walk through the main court." His nostrils flared, as if fighting a different answer with his whole body. Then he nodded. Main court. I flank left. Run right. No one touches you without your permission. They entered the Moon Oath clearing as dusk settled in bruised violet bands above the keep. The ancient stone circle stood ringed by torchlight and ash braziers, runes carved so deep the grooves still held moon silver from rites older than current borders. Pack banners snapped in the wind. Neutral elders occupied the witness dais. Warriors formed a perimeter 3 ranks thick. Word had spread. Every face in Ravencrest seemed turned toward the center. Dante Wildfire waited just inside the outer ring, dressed in black formal wool with a white claimant sash, as if he had come to attend diplomacy rather than attempt abduction. His smile when he saw her was intimate and cruel. The same private expression he used years ago just before saying something designed to leave a mark. You came, he said, voice carrying. I wondered if Ravencrest would keep you hidden behind its king. Isidora stepped over the first rune line and felt the oath field rise around her, cool across skin, exacting and clear. File your claim aloud, she said, then listen when I answer. He lifted a scroll for the witnesses. Under Interpact statute, I reclaim Isidora Stormborn, bond-failed consort of Wildfire Line, unlawfully withheld and used to influence succession outcomes in hostile territory. Murmurs broke around the circle. Dante took one slow step closer, eyes never leaving hers. You were never chosen, he said, softer now, meant only for her and the nearest witnesses. The old wound flared in her chest, but this time the pain met structure. The oath runes beneath her feet recognized stress, pulse, blood heat. Stormborn resonance, long suppressed, answered from somewhere deep and bright, a low vibration climbing her spine. Touch claimant's skin to complete transfer marker, Dante said to the presiding elder, all formal courtesy. Per statute. The elder hesitated. Theron moved, but Isidora raised one hand without looking at him. Let him come close, the gesture said. Let him make his own evidence. Dante reached and closed his fingers around her wrist. Pain speared from the old rejection scar under her sternum to the point of contact, sharp enough to bend her knees. For a heartbeat she was in peril exactly as he intended, body locked, breath stolen, witnesses leaning in as his forged blood ink began to glow along her skin. Then she did what he never imagined she could do. She took the current racing through her scar and pushed it down into the oath circle runes. Silver-gold fire erupted in a clean ring around them. Gasps cut through the crowd. Dante jerked back, but the Truthbind had already engaged, threads of light spiraling up his arm and across his chest where hidden claim markings lay painted under his shirt. The runes burned through fabric without flame. False sigils surfaced in black-red lines for every witness to see. Forgery, Isidora said, voice carrying now with resonance that made the stones answer. Witness marks fabricated, thumbprint falsified, reclamation petition void under oath fire. Rune stepped forward at her signal and shoved a bound man into the witness lane. The missing border sentry, shaking but upright. I took Wildfire coin, the sentry blurted, words tumbling. Dante's factor paid for gate times and seal wax. The thumbprint was pressed from a tavern cup she used months ago. I swear it on Moonlaw. One neutral elder rose to his feet. Record that testimony. Dante's composure fractured at last. Bought fear testimony from a coward means nothing. It means chain of custody is broken. Vea snapped from the council row, voice like a blade. Your petition collapses. He snarled and tore free of one thread of the bind, lunging not for Isidora now, but past her, toward the inner lane where Elske had entered with the pup under heavy guard. Blood checks cleared at every ring by Theron's direct exception, so the Truthbind could verify Heir's safety in public sight. It was the second blade of his plan made visible. If law failed, seize the child. Isidora pivoted and thrust both palms toward him. Stormlight surged from circle to skin to air, a blinding arc that struck his shoulders and hurled him backward into the central stone. He hit hard, breath exploding out of him, and the bind threads snapped tight again around wrists and throat. Theron's shift broke through in a controlled burst, claws at his hands, fangs bared, amber blazing as he pinned Dante to the stone with one forearm across his chest. The crowd roared for judgment. Theron looked to Isadora and held position. He did not take the final word. She walked into the center of the circle, every face upon her, and spoke the vows Dante had once made before sacred fire. I stand beside you in witness and in storm. I do not weaponize your weakness. I do not name you lesser to protect my pride. I do not cast you out to purchase status. Each line ignited another rune over Dante's torso. With the last line, the false claim marks blistered into ash and vanished. Dante bared his teeth at her. You are nothing without a male name. The clearing went still enough to hear torch oil spit. Isadora met his gaze without shaking. I was nothing only when I believed you. She turned to the presiding elder. Under pack law and oath circle proof, I reject Dante Wildfire in full return, void all past bond claims and petition sentence. Exile branding and permanent territorial banishment from Ravencrest and allied borders. The elder raised his staff. Sentence permitted, enforcement immediate. Dante thrashed once as guards closed in with the iron brand heated in oath fire. Theron stepped back on Isadora's command and let the law take him. The brand touched cloth at Dante's shoulder, flared bright, and left the exile sigil stamped through claim sash and skin beneath without spectacle. He shouted curses as they dragged him to the ward gate, voice breaking on threats no one answered. At the boundary stones he twisted for one last look, hate and disbelief warring across his face. Then the ward keepers opened the outer line just long enough to throw him beyond it, and the sigils sealed behind him in a single hard pulse of silver light. The ward keepers opened the outer line just long enough to throw him beyond it, and the sigils sealed behind him in a single hard pulse of silver light. The sound rang through Isadora's bones like a struck bell. For the first time since the wedding fire, the world did not tilt toward Dante's voice. She stood in the center of the stone circle with her hands still raised, stormlight fading from her skin in slow threads. Theron reached her in 3 strides and stopped a breath away, every line of him taut with checked violence. Are you hurt? He asked, the words stripped bare. My wrist, she said, looking down at the red marks where Dante had grabbed her. Nothing deeper. Only when she nodded did Theron touch her, his hand closing around her forearm with reverent care, as if confirming she was solid and here. Matron Elska approached with the pup wrapped in gray wool. The child was awake, wide-eyed, then made a small sound and leaned toward Isadora with instant certainty. Isadora gathered her close, pressed her cheek to soft hair, and felt her breath finally settle into a steady rhythm. In the receiving chamber an hour later, under oath lamps and witness slate, every loose thread was tied to record. The forged reclamation parchments from Theron's iron box were entered as fraud exhibits, seal cuts and reset wax documented by the neutral legal archivist Theron had summoned. Rune placed his payment folio before the elders and named each falsified kitchen transfer, then delivered the quartermaster clerk for sentencing to labor service under guard. The seized saddlebags inventory was matched line by line, sleeping tincture to the shattered dart in the nursery corridor, infant swaddling cloth to Dante's extraction plan, and the route sketch to the bypass patrol path now permanently closed. The intimidation hide strip that read, "You were never chosen," was traced to the reassigned guard, who confessed and accepted exile to a border monastery instead of prison, by Elsky's request, because she said broken men taught by consequence were better than broken men caged in grievance. Vea watched that ruling in hard silence, then gave one short nod when Isadora met her eyes. By the time moonlight silvered the nursery windows, Ravencrest law had done what fear could not. It had held. The keep quieted in layers, corridor by corridor, until only hearth crackle and infant breathing remained. The pup slept in the cradle between them, one fist curled near her mouth. Isadora stood by the window with a shawl around her shoulders, looking at the ward stones far below where Dante had vanished. She heard Theron close the nursery door and draw the inner bolt. "I asked the healers to check your wrist again," he said. "No fracture." She turned. He had removed his council mantle and bracers, leaving a plain dark shirt open at the throat, the pale ritual scar visible where prophecy had once cut him. He looked less like a king in that moment, and more like a man who had reached the end of running. "Come here," he said, then corrected himself immediately. "If you want to." Isadora crossed the room. The bond between them hummed, warm and undeniable, no longer a wound searching for pain, but a current asking to be named. She stopped close enough to feel his body heat. Theron held her gaze. "I need plain words. No ritual pressure, no audience, no law forcing your answer." His voice roughened. "Do you consent to claiming me as your mate tonight, fully, in both directions?" The question struck her with greater force than any command he could have given, because it left room for refusal, and trusted her to use it. She thought of blue fire and public erasure, of dawn panic and warmed linen, of him standing in front of a chamber full of knives and making his own authority the shield. "Yes," she said, "I consent, by choice." He exhaled as if he had been holding that breath for years. "Then hear mine. I will never weaponize bond, rank, or law against you. I will not use your past as leverage and anger. If I fail that promise, you may challenge me before pack and crown, and I will answer." Isadora reached up and touched the scar at his throat with 2 fingers. "I hear you." Theron bared the left side of his neck and shoulder in a gesture older than written statute, absolute in its vulnerability. "Your turn first," he said softly. "So you know this is not ownership. It is equal claim." Emotion climbed her throat too quickly to swallow. She stepped in, set her hand at the back of his neck, and felt him shudder once under her touch. She kissed the skin over his pulse, then bit. Not a tear, not brutality, but a deep, deliberate mark that drew a low sound from him and dropped him to one knee, head bowed against her sternum in reverence. Heat flared where her teeth met him, racing through her jaw, down her spine, into the old rejection scar, until the scar answered with light instead of pain. "Mine," she whispered, stunned by the rightness of it. Theron lifted his face, amber bright in the dim room, and rose. "Yours," he said. He cupped her jaw, waiting one heartbeat for any sign of retreat. She leaned into his hand. He bent and placed his mouth at the junction of her neck and shoulder, exactly where fear had lived for months. The bite came sharp, then grounding, pain blooming into a fierce pleasure that spread in widening rings through her chest and limbs. She gripped his shirt, breath breaking as the bond flashed visible between them, fine gold threads winding from his mark to hers, then sinking beneath skin. The old burn under her sternum ignited, not as injury this time, but as proof rewritten. She felt what moved through him into her and back again. Protectiveness without control, desire braided with devotion, grief acknowledged and not denied, and a steady, almost sacred peace that settled where panic used to rule. "Mate." He breathed against her skin. She answered at his throat, lips to the mark she had given him. "Mate." They stayed pressed together, foreheads touching, hands learning each other in small, careful motions, while the bond completed in quiet surges. No crowd, no spectacle. Just chosen belonging built breath by breath. When words returned, they spoke them together, different tones, same vow. Mine by choice, mine in truth, mine in peace. The pup stirred and made a sleepy protest at being ignored. Isidora laughed once, wet-eyed and unsteady, and Theron laughed with her, a low sound of astonished relief. They lifted the child between them and sat on the rug beside the cradle until all three breathing patterns found one shared cadence. At first light, the great hall filled again, but this time no one stood waiting for her collapse. Banner cloth stirred in the draft from open clear-story windows. Elders, captains, matrons, and envoys formed witness rows around the dais. Isidora entered at Theron's side in slate and silver, her new Luna Torque resting above the fresh mark at her shoulder. The pup rode on Elsky's hip, solemn and bright-eyed, occasionally grabbing for the moon charm at Elsky's collar. Theron did not speak first. He ceded the floor to Isidora by formal bow. She stepped to the oath stone. Under Ravencrest Charter and Allied Witness, I accept recognition as Luna Queen and co-guardian of the heir. My first decree is Amendment of Reclamation Law. Rejected mates cannot be claimed as property by any former bond partner, under any court, for any debt fiction. Violations trigger automatic sanctions across signatory pacts. Vea rose, rings glinting in morning light. Council seconds the amendment. Her gaze was direct, unsoftened, but no longer hostile. And records that my earlier objections stand corrected by evidence. Rune followed, fist to chest. City Guard ratifies and assumes enforcement. I submit my resignation for failure of internal security. Isidora looked at him for a measured moment. Denied. You stay and rebuild the system you let fray. Accountability is work, not theater. A ripple moved through the hall, surprise turning to approval. Rune bowed, this time with respect unforced. The neutral elders signed first, then border representatives, then Ravencrest Council. The forged wildfire documents were fed into a brazier and reduced to ash under witness. The iron box that had held them was placed in the public archive, with a new plaque naming the case that changed succession law. By noon, messengers left for every Allied territory carrying sealed copies of the Charter Revision and Dante's banishment order. When the formalities ended, the keep did not erupt. It exhaled. Kitchen girls brought honey cakes into the courtyard. Guards removed half the emergency barricades. Nara, finally smiling without exhaustion, handed Isidora a clean feeding cloth and said, "For the record, the heir still prefers your shoulder to all known furniture." By evening, Isidora stood on the west balcony with Theron and the pup wrapped between them, watching torchlights kindle along Ravencrest walls one by one. Below, ward stones glowed steady. No alarms, no running feet. Theron kissed her temple, then the mark at her shoulder. "Home," he said, as if testing the word against truth. Isidora looked at the child drowsing against her chest, at the king who had learned to kneel without surrendering strength, at the keep that had seen her as scandal, and now answered to laws she helped write. "Home," she agreed. "Ours."